My name's Hughes. I work for Nielsen based in Sydney. Before relocating back to Sydney at the end of last year, I spent 8 years living and working in China. The more recent 7 based in Shanghai, and prior to that 18 months working out of Shenzhen in southern China. So what does Nielsen do? We measure consumers, and we measure that all over the world, currently in 104 countries, including China. What they watch, so TV, online, etc., and what they buy, but also their attitudes and behaviours about where they're going to spend their money. So the agenda today is going to cover some of the key trends we're seeing in Chinese consumers, and it's a story that covers 3 elements. Soaring consumer confidence in China currently, how that consumer confidence is seeing a new consumption power emerging in what we call Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. And the major driver of that consumption power is in the evolving middle class. We'll talk about that a little. So I'll share some of Nielsen's data and views on those consumer elements, as well as some of my own personal experiences from living and working there. And hopefully by understanding some of those consumer trends, it will help you drive better business decisions. That's what Nielsen's all about. So the 20-minute whirlwind tour. We're going to start with consumer confidence. So Nielsen measures consumer confidence all around the world. And you might ask, why do we do that? Basically, consumer confidence is an advanced indicator of economic outcomes. So as consumer sentiment changes, typically about 3 to 6 months after that, the economic impacts follow on. This chart shows trends in consumer confidence in China, measured quarterly from Q1 2009 through to the end of last year. The way to read that chart, with the numbers on the left, think of 100 as the benchmark. If you score 100, you're sort of in the middle. You're not positive, you're not negative. Above 100 says you're feeling optimistic about the future. Below 100, pessimistic about the future. And we benchmark countries against a global average, and China typically likes to benchmark itself against the US, so we put US on here. The key message here is Chinese consumer confidence has never been as high as it is today. We've tracked that back for many years, the periods of really high economic growth prior to the global financial crisis. It's never been as high as what we see today. So it did drop back after the GFC, 2008, 2009, but China has always stayed well ahead of the other markets. So what's behind that historic increase in the last year or so in China? When we ask people about confidence, there are 3 components. We ask about your expectation on your employment prospects, your expectation on your personal finances, and your expectation or willingness to spend money versus save money. And we can see here in the more recent quarters, yes, there's been an increase in the employment prospects, so that's part of the driver, but the real significant change is the steady growth in the last 12 months on willingness to spend. And again, it's never been that high in China. And again, you've got to remember, China is very much a saving culture. It's not a many credit cards, spending and debt culture like we have in Australia. So that is a significant cultural shift. I guess over the years, when we track this back, it's been buffeted around by the global financial crisis, inflationary concerns on food prices and housing. But there are other more broad impacts that are helping that figure in the most recent year. And based on my time in China, just as a nation, I think China is feeling more comfortable about its position on the world stage. So from the Beijing Olympics 2008, World Expo in Shanghai 2010, Asian Games in Guangzhou 2010, subsequently overtaking Japan to be the world's 2nd largest economy. It's all just built that confidence as a nation. But even more recently, since Xi Jinping took over in early last year, I think there's a lot of just confidence in the leadership that he's brought to the nation. and particularly his hardline stance around corruption and the anti-corruption policies that he's put in place, I think have given individual consumers more confidence in their position. So willingness to spend is up. So why is that? Well, there's three elements. An increase in disposable income for both urban and rural residents, so that enables their capability to spend. There's the slowing rate of price inflation, with government action successfully cooling some of the pressures around house pricing and food pricing that we saw a couple of years ago. You may be familiar with Unilever, a big multinational company, makes a lot of shampoo and laundry detergents that you have in your home. In 2011, they announced to the media that they might be thinking about putting their prices up. That caused a bit of a stir. Inflation was a big concern. People ran off to the supermarket to stock up on the products before the price went up. The government didn't like that, and they fined Unilever for letting that information get to the media. You just can't imagine that here, that a company could be fined for announcing it might put its prices up. It's just an example of how the government can control some of the economic outcomes. And lastly, Chinese-style shopping carnivals. So e-commerce is huge in China. That's one of the things we measure. And the retailers have been at the core of creating excitement around Chinese-style shopping festivals. So when we think of shopping festivals, it's Christmas, maybe Mother's Day, Father's Day. China has its traditional shopping festivals around Chinese New Year, January, February, and then the National Day holiday or Golden Week in the first week of October. But there's now a proliferation of other shopping festivals that especially the online or e-commerce retailers have taken advantage of. So you see one there for November 11, that's referred to as Singles Day, 11, 11th of November. It's always been there as a festival, but is now a major shopping day driven by Alibaba, the e-commerce giant. So they have taken advantage of that, especially around clothing and electronic sales. Subsequent to that, their competitors, Jingdong and Yihaodian, are now pushing their version of 11/11, but on the 12th of December, 12/12. So these things keep growing. Other festivals, Chinese Valentine's Day on the 7th of July, but even increasingly around the Western festivals like our Valentine's Day in February, etc. All part of helping to stimulate consumer spending. Private consumption versus investment, that's underlying that because the government's implemented policies around structured economic change. So it's gone from an export and investment-driven economy to the government saying, I want it to be a domestic consumption-driven economy from 2010 onward. So after global financial crisis, it was infrastructure investments around roads, trains, airports. 2010 onward, more about domestic consumption, less reliance on exports as other economies struggled through their recession. So government direction is really important. When a chart like this goes up that says in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, this is how it will happen, we may take that with a grain of salt. Our government goes through an election cycle, has to worry about getting re-elected, has to negotiate with people like Clive Palmer. None of that in China. My experience, when they say it's going to happen this way, you can pretty much rest assured it will happen that way. All right, so new consumption power. We have that Chinese consumer. They're confident like never before, and they have an increasing willingness to spend. Let's have a closer look at their consumption power. We're going to talk about urbanization. So this is the movement of rural Chinese consumers from their towns and villages into the urban centres. It's a graduated but rapidly moving development. So in 2011, for the first time, China became a majority urban population, when urban population hit 51%. By 2020, that's expected to grow to 60%. So that represents 240 million people moving from rural to urban living. So that's the equivalent of one of the whole Indonesian population, two German populations, or 4 UK populations on the move, or another 240 million individuals moving to higher income lifestyles and helping to drive that domestic consumption. So we come back to consumer confidence, and it's really important to look at this across what we call the different city tiers. So we typically look at China, if you're not familiar, in terms of city tiers. So we've got total China on your left, and then tier 1 cities is the 4 key cities of Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Chengdu. Then tier 2 cities is the provincial capitals. So think of those as our state capital cities. And then the tier 3 cities are the next level down within those provinces or states, and then right through to the rural areas. So we saw total consumer confidence was 111 for China. Its highest in those tier 1 cities at 114. But looking back at the quarters prior, it was always higher, or always high in those cities. Where we've seen a significant increase in the last quarter is in the tier 2 and tier 3 cities, where you see the big jump highlighted in red. So we refer to 2014 as the year of mass consumption. And that means consumption for everyone, not just a privilege for the wealthy few or the upper class. It's driven by people having more money, higher disposable income, plus that increased willingness to spend that money. And you should all know China is quite vast, so it's important to understand some of those city tier differences. Tier 1, those 4 key cities, when it comes to modern trade development, whether it's retail industry, competition, resources or population, really quite saturated. For foreign brands, if you're the Prada or the Louis Vuitton, the race to get to those 4 cities, that race was done 10 years ago. It's now just about a fight for market share. The last 5 to 10 years, the race has been to get to the tier 2 and the tier 3 cities. And it's not just about people physically moving into those cities. This modern urbanisation has the government policy support and the dramatic change of the consumers we see in those city tiers. So there used to be a big difference in tier 1 city consumers versus tier 2 and tier 3 city consumers, how they saw themselves and how they saw their opportunities for their lifestyle and quality of life. But now that the people in the tier 2 and 3 cities are earning more, that gap has closed and they have the same expectations. And we have to note the scale of those tier 2 and 3 cities and the consumers they represent. We're talking 252 cities, 113 million households, around 44% of China's spending power. So that boosted Chinese consumer confidence, very much driven by the high-flying job prospects and the purchase intentions of the people in those cities. And they're travelling more. This just looks at travel from mainland China to Hong Kong. In 2012, 31% of those travellers to Hong Kong were from tier 2 and tier 3 cities. 1 year later, 54%. It's a significant change in such a short period of time. So we have that high consumer confidence driven by increased willingness to spend and that emerging consumption power of the tier 2 and 3 cities. But what are some of the social characteristics of that consumption power? Here on the left in 2010 we see the majority of Chinese families are in the lower income classes. But by 2020 the shape of that graph, or the population of middle class consumers, will follow the same pattern as the USA population. And the main force of high-end product consumption is not just the high-income classes, but also the middle class. So Nielsen does a lot of research across household and personal categories, and it shows that high-income consumers and middle-income consumers are equally likely to buy into premium products. So in some areas, such as food, that's partly driven by some of the food scandals that we've seen in China, for example, the tainted infant milk formula from a few years ago. So people will want to buy the higher quality, more trusted premium brand. However, it's also about aspiration. The middle income consumers purchasing premium products because they want to aspire to that kind of lifestyle. This aspiration is based on both income and education. So during the past 10 years, University education levels in China have increased from 1% to 7% of the population. And at the same time, discretionary or disposable income has grown at around 4 times. So as more and more money has found its way into the pockets of the Chinese people, they've formed a more sophisticated lifestyle. I guess the subtle way I saw that in China was the Starbucks coffee shop, the big American chain that was in the bottom of our office building. They're everywhere in Shanghai, there's Starbucks coffee shops. But when I got there, you go into Starbucks, it was mostly foreigners in there and a few Chinese. 7 years later, it was mostly Chinese, and not just in there, but queued up 20 long out the door to get their Starbucks, and there was another Starbucks in the next building. So it might be partly about a coffee culture growing in China, but it's also partly about that aspiration. So Starbucks coffee is not cheap in Shanghai. But just to be seen as being in Starbucks and consuming a Starbucks coffee, being able to afford it, says something about your lifestyle. However, but with higher education and higher income comes more pressure. Population per household is declining, and with the one-child policy in China in recent decades, if you're a young couple, as a couple, you're also taking care of both sets of parents and your child. You don't have the siblings to share that responsibility with. Chinese are known as a hard-working population. That's true, and that continues. We estimate around 26% longer working hours compared to the US. But all of this makes the new generation of Chinese consumers a high-pressured group, less time for their own enjoyment and less patience for domestic duties. In the past, consumers, it was about social recognition. It was very important how you looked from the perspective of your family, your relatives, your work colleagues, your friends, and the community. You buy the brands that everyone knows and the majority of people believe are good, so that you have face. Now, it's different. It's a lot more about self-identity, it's about individualism, it's about being me. They look for something that other people might not even know. They want to be different. So consumers don't have the time. We talked about the pressure. They want convenience to help them out with that. Under that pressure, they look for ways to release it. They want excitement. They want inspiration, that feeling of life's too short, let's have some fun. They have more income. They desperately want a better quality life, and they really enjoy the feeling of indulgence. So it's an important change we're seeing over time. Geographically common in Tier 1 cities, but now developing into Tier 2 and 3 cities. And then on travel, a few things to finish up. How does that relate to travel? So with greater disposable income, Chinese consumers are looking for better life quality, not just life necessities. 5 times as many trips abroad, and 57% of those now independent tours, enabled by higher levels of education and increased capabilities of speaking in English. And on those trips, those people are spending 70% more, based on that strong desire to reward themselves and treat themselves better. Specific segments driving the market, I'm sure you'll hear more about this today, but these sophisticated or luxury tourism niche consumers classify themselves into that different demand group. They believe their life status requires different functional products and experiences, adding to their own self-identity, enjoying cultural experiences outside of the standard tour group itinerary. So we hear it a lot. Today's luxury travellers want the world's most luxurious travel experience and pampering, but they also want an off-the-beaten-track experience while they're there. And lastly, we should not forget the importance of the convenience aspect of technology and how quickly this is advancing in China. So with the rapid growth of smartphones in popularity, we see significant increases in the amount of travel products being purchased through smartphone applications via providers such as Ctrip and Junar. And also apps. I see Chinese travellers in Australia, maybe their English language is not so good, doesn't matter so much anymore. They can have the app that will do the translation and help them survive. So in summary, that's where we leave for 2014. Thank you.
Australia shine.